The US delivers a formal rebuke to the UK, normally reserved for enemies, not for allies. Falling vaccination rates mean the US is unlikely to meet its target for Independence Day, and is the UK betraying the poor by cutting back on its foreign aid? My name is Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. The United States issued an extraordinary diplomatic rebuke to the UK over the impact of Brexit on the Northern Ireland peace process in the run-up to the G7 summit this week. The démarche is a formal reprimand that's not habitually directed at allied countries. Although the administration had expressed its concerns over the situation in Northern Ireland, it came somewhat out of the blue in terms of apparently taking the EU's position in that dispute and doing so in the most humiliating terms for the Johnson government. It said that if Britain accepted the demands to follow the EU rules on agricultural standards, then Biden would not in that case stand in the way of a US-UK trade deal. The US Chargé d'Affaires in London, Yael Lempert, read out the démarche to the government's Brexit minister, Lord Frost, reportedly slowly and gravely to reinforce the weight of importance the administration placed on it. Frost told Lempert that the EU had prioritised the integrity of the single market over peace in Northern Ireland and suggested that Biden should tell European leaders to take a less purist approach. So that was all a good preamble to a nice few days in sunny Cornwall at the G7 summit. It was all smiles later though when Johnson and Biden posed for photographs and joked about what fabulous wives they had. Because that's what you talk about when you're trying to avoid the serious stuff, I suppose. Interestingly, there was no post-summit press conference after Biden and Johnson had met together, which is probably more to do with Joe Biden's aversion to them than anything else. Since becoming president, Biden has hosted precisely one full press conference. Now, maybe that's because he simply decided that he hates them. And he's decided, therefore, he's not going to play ball. And that would be fairly remarkable. But, you know, he's the president. He can do what he wants. If it's more to do with what many suspect, that his cognitive state can't cope easily with the length of time and focus that a full press conference throws at him, then you'd have to think that this will eventually start now to come out, especially now that face-to-face summits and meetings are beginning to happen again. You have to wonder how long it'll be before we start getting behind-the-scenes gossip about how this played out in some of those long, tedious summits. Will that matter? I mean, certainly President Reagan was in decline in the latter part of his second term. Indeed, people were speculating heavily about it and campaigning on it in the election for his second term. But with the support of a team around him, and of course from his wife Nancy, he was able to function mostly pretty effectively. In any case, Johnson and Biden did at least manage a joint statement calling for pragmatic solutions to the dispute over the Northern Ireland Protocol. President Macron, arriving for the summit, showed little appetite for taking that advice, saying that he would veto any attempts to renegotiate arrangements around Northern Ireland. He said this: "We have a protocol under which there is this Northern Ireland Protocol and we have a trade deal. It has been painfully discussed for years and discussed, let me remind you, on the initiative of the British, who decided to leave and not the Europeans." How much that stance was emboldened by the kicking that the Biden administration gave to Britain, we don't know. But while the EU leaders might be quietly celebrating that humiliation to the Brexit nemesis, they'll be more soberly digesting the recent polling information. Public faith in the EU institutions has fallen significantly due to their handling of the COVID pandemic. In France, it has reached the point where as many people would be happy out of the EU as would want to be in it. Oh la la! Something of a slap in the face for President Macron. Topical reference there. Which is not likely to be an issue unless the extraordinary happened and Macron was ousted at the next election by Marine Le Pen. Other than France, EU citizens still have faith in the project overall, believe in the need for greater coordination and indeed in strengthening of the EU as a global actor. A real point of tension settles over Germany because disappointment with the EU is particularly acute there. EU citizens also remain sceptical about the suggested restoration of American leadership, and they feel that the Western alliance that faced Cold War #1 has largely disappeared into history, which is significant, given that we seem to be already either in, according to historian Neil Ferguson, or poised on the edge of Cold War #2, this time with China. China will be a major feature of the behind closed doors discussions at the G7. Britain specifically invited India, South Korea and Australia to the discussion in the attempt to form a wider alliance of democracies in the face of Chinese power. Next month we'll see celebrations of the Chinese Communist Party's 100th anniversary, and they're preparing for these celebrations in the style that we have come to expect, namely by arresting members of dissident groups or anyone that might be tempted to sour the outpourings of pure spontaneous joy to be expected from the citizenry. Included in the arrests were, according to the Times of London, supporters of Mao Zedong, who believe that the party has abandoned Mao's vision by embracing all of this economic liberalism, such as Ma Huzhi, who founded the Chinese Mao Zedong Communist Party in 2009 and served 10 years in prison for his pains. Good to know that some people managed to be nostalgic for the glory days of the Great Famine and the Cultural Revolution, I suppose. In a few minutes we'll look at a roundup of the rest of the week's news, but first, 3 months ago I did my first video looking at the emerging evidence for the COVID lab leak hypothesis. At that point, it wasn't something sensible people were supposed to be taking seriously, and that meant a whole bunch of people missed the fact that there was emerging evidence and discussion going on. Well, the topic has rather blown up over the last few weeks, and a lot more has been spoken and written about it. Some interesting extra details have been added to the mix, as well as a few more dubious assertions. So how do things currently stand? Well, I'll be looking at that for the video to go live next week on Monday at 7 PM UK time. Join me then. The US vaccination rate has slowed down significantly, which you can tell even if you don't look at the data, just on account of the fact that various authorities have started offering incentives, from cash prizes to guns. But even with those tempting offers, it now seems unlikely that President Biden will reach his goal of having 70% of American adults having had at least one jab by July the 4th, although it's going to get close, 67% around. At the peak, over 3.4 million people were being vaccinated every day. That has now fallen to less than 1 million. And it's likely not to be enough to reach full herd immunity, at least according to some scientists. And especially not since the goalposts on that side keep moving. So in the UK, Professor Tim Spector, Professor of Genetic Epidemiology at King's College London, suggested that the increased transmissibility of the Indian variant meant that the threshold for herd immunity had increased all of the way up to 95%. Now, he didn't provide a reference for that figure, and it did seem to be rather casually estimated, but it was enough to generate some reporting on the news websites. He was responding to a tweet linking to an open letter from Tess Lawrie of the evidence-based medicine consultancy, which suggested that a preliminary analysis that they'd carried out on MHRA yellow card data, which is public reports of problems experienced after vaccinations, gave them cause for concern, with 1,253 deaths reported out of the 39 million vaccinations as at 26th of May. Tess Lawrie has had a high profile in recent months as an active campaigner for the use of ivermectin as a treatment for COVID. Now, the MHRA has said that the figures are not those that have died because of the vaccines. Given the large numbers of people being vaccinated, you would expect that a certain percentage of those would die in the natural course of events soon afterwards anyway, and the reported numbers are in line with that expected number. And you would expect that if such numbers were generally as aberrant as Lawrie was suggesting, there would be reports flooding in from across the world. I mean, see how quickly the first reports came that there was a relatively minor effect on blood clots. So neither the herd immunity figure nor the alarm over yellow card reports seem to be based on solid research or data, which will be some comfort to people in poorer countries who should be seeing vaccines coming their way in the coming months. The US announced this week that it was sending 500 million doses to be used in the poorest countries. The UK announced its own figure of 100 million to follow, setting the theme of rich companies helping out the poorer ones as one of the key areas of focus for the G7 summit. And very topical that turns out to be. This week, the UK confirmed that it will reduce its foreign aid budget from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5% when an attempt by MPs to get an amendment passed that would block the move was ruled to be inadmissible. Campaigning charities such as Oxford and ActionAid UK said that the move would cause devastation to the poorest communities ahead of the G7 summit. The government said that the move was necessary and reasonable, given that the pandemic has caused record levels of peacetime public borrowing. It said that the cut would be restored when possible, although there's no indication of when that would be expected. A letter signed by 1,700 academics, charities and business leaders said that while other G7 countries have stepped up their aid budget, the UK is the only one to have rowed back on its commitments. And in a separate comment, these aid cuts fundamentally undermine the UK's credibility in the eyes of other G7 countries. That one from a spokesperson of the International Rescue Committee. This is the game that people play, of course. The G7 summit is coming, so let's play on that to maximise leverage. But in 2020, the UK spent £14.5 billion on aid, with the top 5 recipients being Pakistan, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Yemen and Nigeria. After the cuts, the UK will still be spending £10 billion. And a few things to note here. According to the Donor Tracker website, in 2019, the UK was the 5th most generous foreign donor in percentage of GDP terms, topped only by Luxembourg, Norway, Sweden and Denmark. If that list remained unchanged, dropping to 0.5% of GDP would only cause Britain to drop 2 places on the list. As for the G7, according to Wikipedia using data from the OECD, the US provided aid of 0.18% of GDP. Germany was at 0.6%, although I know that's risen in 2019 to 0.73%. Japan 0.2, France 0.4, Italy 0.24, Canada 0.27. So Germany notwithstanding, it's unlikely the G7 spent a lot of time tut-tutting at the UK for dropping to a percentage that is still more than double what a number of them are giving. Second, it's worth noting that the people slamming the UK for cutting aid weren't being especially vocal about giving it credit in the past when it was giving that aid. But it's not the permanently outraged people that provided the most important kickback, because a number of Conservative MPs have been leading the opposition to this, since it was, after all, a Tory Prime Minister, David Cameron, who first pushed it to that number. When the higher number was first introduced, you had the opposite stories. The press were covering examples of how aid money was being spent on patently useless projects. Because, the bureaucracy struggled to suddenly find ways to constructively and usefully give away so much money. And maybe that was teething troubles, and things are now a lot better targeted. Although some have recently highlighted that in 2019, Britain donated a record £71 million to rising superpower China. But of course, the truth is that if you snatch away £4 billion that had previously been promised and expected, much of which was going on valuable work, then inevitably there are going to be some demonstrably negative short-term consequences. Although, maybe given the situation, you should perhaps reframe it as passing up the opportunity to mitigate existing negative consequences. Bob Geldof may have likened it to taking bread from a child's mouth in Yemen. But with respect to Sir Bob, giving £10 billion in aid is not quite the same as snatching food from children's mouths. And this all because 0.7% is being changed to 0.5%. But why is 0.7% the correct and moral figure? If 0.7% is better, then why not double it to 1.4%? Where is the moral optimum level? Do we know? Well, of course not. We just know that it's always going to be more than the government's actually committing, regardless of whether we're in the top rank of donors or not. But there is a bigger question on all of this, and it doesn't get asked because the mere asking of it can sound callous and simply invites the inevitable moralistic comeback. and that is whether the aid has the beneficial consequences long term that people think it does. One of the criticisms of the huge aid budget is that while providing short-term relief to some people who desperately need it, de facto you end up propping up some of the worst governments in the world, and the outcomes of those people therefore is worse. The transformation of the last few decades that saw the majority of countries move from extreme poverty to the mid-ground did not happen because of the giving of aid, any more than the problems of starvation in India in the 70s and 80s were resolved by flying in food aid. They were solved by the Green Revolution. It is absolutely right that countries of significant wealth have the opportunity and the obligation to be good citizens. You can call it enlightened self-interest if you wish. The question should always be, what is the impact and at what cost, rather than simply what people are discussing right now, how much money? All right, in a minute, we'll get to responding to comments and the final thought for the week. But first, when it comes to COVID-19 and climate change, we hear all about whether or not the policy is, quote, following the science. One of the most important areas where policy mistakes would be particularly unforgiving is how we produce food. The people most worried about climate change often cite fears about future famines as one of the doomsday scenarios. Now, even though the terms of those discussions are often overblown, there's no doubt that a planet of 9 billion people will be dependent as never before on a food system that needs to be efficient and also resilient to the shocks that we might reasonably expect. If there's one place where we need to be following the science, it's here. So, are we? There's a lot of change going on. Is it improvement or progress? Is it going down a blind alley? Are we sure we know the difference anyway? I will be looking at these broad issues across this crucial area in the video to go live on Wednesday next week at 7 p.m. UK time. Join me then. Now, thanks to those who came along to the live stream I did this week. The first one, I would say, where there were no technical glitches to speak of. You have to do these things a few times before you discover all the ways they can go wrong. Reviewing the chat comments after it was over, I realised I should have repeated a few times my formula for asking questions, which is that you start the message with the word question so that I can filter for those when I'm answering them. And there were a couple of good ones asked by people who probably had joined the live stream after I'd mentioned that, and I forgot to repeat it. So therefore, apologies to you if I missed your question. And I also didn't see certain other comments, like this one from Rads. Hey Mallen, just wanted to say that you helped me through a pretty difficult time regarding climate change where I was having high anxiety because of the XR Extinction Rebellion articles I accidentally found online. Rads, thanks for feedback, and I am delighted if I have been able to make a difference to you in that way. I've not felt the need to do as much on Extinction Rebellion lately as they've become rather less prominent through the pandemic. I do note that Roger Hallam recently did a video titled Advice to Young People as They Face Annihilation, which has had over 30,000 views on his channel. I'm pondering whether I should do a response to that, or if it's reached the stage where if it's left alone it will just gradually disappear of its own accord. Now, there was a long comment in response to the Steve Koonin video, and it goes through a lot of things, and it includes this paragraph. Perhaps it is time, Mr. Baker, to pick a side. You have read the various reports. You are aware of the consensus findings and predictions of hundreds, if not thousands, of pedigreed climate scientists and the views of a much smaller number of credentialed skeptics. Is radical change to the environment likely to happen due to the continuing and increasing use of fossil fuels? Yes or no? Is it time for Mallen to pick a side? Well, the way that's expressed, the answer is always going to be no. And this goes to the entire point of this channel, at least how it's evolved into being. I research topics drawing from the scientific reports and the debates between scientists and politicians and others, and I represent the data and the arguments as honestly as I can. By picking a side, inevitably that means that you stop paying attention to the most interesting debates, the challenges to your own orthodoxy, the grey areas with the difficult trade-offs, unless, of course, they benefit the side that you're pitching for. Which presumably would then involve only ever critiquing the faults of the other side and only ever lauding the merits of your own. Well, I was never able to do that even when I wanted to, which was just another reason why I left politics 3 decades ago. Neither side has a monopoly on wisdom, nor indeed a monopoly on stupidity. Anyone in power or influence is improved by having their assumptions constructively challenged. Now, really, this commenter was asking, did I accept the IPCC science or not? And I'm guessing they haven't been watching my videos for that long because, of course, I've covered that plenty. And, of course, I do. I've said numerous times the commitment of the UK to net zero by 2050, following the approach given by the Committee on Climate Change, seems a mostly rational and probably achievable approach. And yes, of course, there will always be trench warfare types in the comments who will jump on any expression of uncertainty and say things like, "Oh, so you agree with Tony Heller now?" Well, I'm not going to adjust what I say for fear of such misrepresentation. I mean, I remind you, 3 months ago, I covered the evidence for the lab leak hypothesis at a time when people on your side said that such a thing was no more than a Trump-style conspiracy theory. The scientists who kept their mouths shut on this, even though we now find they had misgivings, some of them, they were picking their side. They were not saying anything for fear of giving succor to the Trump supporters. Now, did that help us or hinder us in finding our way towards the truth? Always feel free to draw my attention to the best research, the best arguments to shape what I put out there. But pick a side? Well, okay, I'll be on the side that looks at the data and the evidence and uses that to form conclusions. If one of the pre-existing sides wants to join me there, then fair enough. I will welcome them with open arms. 2 years ago, Maya Forstater was at an employment tribunal and was told that her belief that men and women cannot biologically become members of the opposite sex, that belief was, quote, not worthy of respect in a democratic society. Yesterday, that ruling was overturned, and thank goodness. As the ruling judge noted, that belief is shared by a significant percentage of the population, and it actually reflects de facto important parts of the existing law. So if you could turn around on the basis of an aggressive campaign propaganda, something so fundamental overnight, we would really be into new and dangerous territory. Sometimes people dismiss the various stories around the so-called culture wars, arguing that it all really means that we're just not very serious people, that we're fighting over trivialities, name-calling nonsense. But fighting over the right not to go along with nonsense is one of the most important duties that a serious people can have. One of the marks of a true dictator through history was to put forward a demonstrably ridiculous proposition and demand that you believe it through loyalty to the dictator. And by caving into the demand and accepting the ridiculous thing and championing it, you give yourself over to the power of those who insisted that you should believe it and demean yourself by so doing. Right now, this is a demand that's being asked of people in the US, on both sides of the aisle. If you don't literally believe that a man can be a woman, then you can be punished in the most career-ending fashion. And, on the other side, if you won't swear your certainty that Trump actually won the 2020 election, and even now that maybe he's going to be reinstated magically somehow, then you should expect an assault from the party base. Both of these would be laughably dumb if they weren't at the heart of a serious process. Partisanship becoming intolerant of free thought and an attachment to reality amongst its own side. It does seem as though the UK was tempted to follow America, because we follow America in so many things, of course, but we do now seem to be pulling away, because we don't have leaders here pushing that reality gap to cement our loyalty specifically to them. So the head of Cambridge University was ridiculed into reversal for trying to institutionalise microaggressions. And now a judge has ruled that the simple expression of biological truth cannot be held as an opinion on the odious level of Nazism and authoritarianism which it would have to be in order for it not to be protected. When someone is granted a gender recognition certificate, the judge said, the law says that they become the acquired gender for all legal purposes, which is not to say, as the campaigners had argued, for all purposes. Therefore, it doesn't mean everyone has to believe it. What you believe is up to you. It doesn't erase history. So, for instance, yes, you can talk about the fact that Bruce Jenner was a successful athlete before he became Caitlyn Jenner. That this even needs to be said is, of course, a remarkable thing. Not only does it need to be said, it needs to be reinforced with social media platforms, some of whom have kicked people off their platforms for saying exactly what the court said they were allowed to say. If you look at the arguments we're having and the things that make headlines, there are lots of reasons to think we're not a serious people right now. The further away from real danger people feel themselves to be, the more apt they are to create drama to fill in the gap. But that's not the same as saying this wasn't a serious principle that was worth fighting for. When people can bully you into believing something that you hold to be patently false, indeed even ridiculous, that is not something to take lightly. All right. Recently, I shared the data showing how this channel has been throttled for traffic over the last few months by YouTube, no longer suggesting its videos to people outside of existing viewers and subscribers. That kicked in soon after the Wuhan lab leak video, amongst others. Was it the cost of talking about things that are held to be bad to talk about? Maybe. Next week, I'm going to be talking about how I'm hoping to fight back against this. But I wouldn't be at that stage at all if it wasn't for the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Thanks to you, I am able to put in the time to produce 3 videos per week and to focus on the topics that matter, regardless of the possible impact on what the algorithm thinks about it. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.